Without the direction of mind, mankind loses his advantage as a species and can hardly compete with a beast. Therefore, if someone were to tell you that you should do just that and relate to the world around you merely as an animal, as the best means for survival, and not think, what would you say? Obviously absurd, right? But if the world around us is the economy, and our relation with the economy is to do nothing, what would happen? Will everyone's individual manufacturing, constructing, buying, and selling, if allowed to be guided merely by unrestrained selfishness and greed, work itself out? Well, when it comes to the derivatives market, held to be in quadrillions of dollars, the refrain is, let it alone. In other words, do nothing. Don't think. Were the derivatives supposed to think for us? At a time when all the governments of the world are meeting together in an attempt to come up with a solution to fix it, why are their economists still huddling around together, paging furiously through textbooks for the answer? They beg, where is the formula, the mechanism that will give us the permission to continue not thinking? Like the glazed-eyed students who chant, what do we have to memorize to pass this test? They want to know what new model will make the economy work so they can resume doing nothing, acting as mere traffic directors or casino managers of the very same derivatives market. As Adam Smith wrote in his Wealth of Nations, when it comes to the economy, let it alone. Or in other words, do nothing. It's the only approach that is religiously acceptable. What religion is this? Usury. Truly, as will be made clear in this and the following episodes, until the assumptions underlying this religion are identified, and the government acts with a consciousness of their falseness, adopting the correct alternative, there is no hope to avoid the full weight and horror of the global derivatives claims, destroying civilization in a fate far worse than that of the 14th century collapse of the Venetian usurious banking system. Hence, now is the time for you to listen closely. In the 1750s, militarily, the world consisted of rival states, but no one dominant force. This changed in the year 1763 as the First World War, a 7 Years' War, involving the whole of Europe and stretching as far as India and the East Indies, came to a close. The British East India Company came out of the war claiming Canada, the Mississippi and Ohio, part of Florida, and India from the French, the East Indies from the Dutch, and rose victorious as the British Empire, the world's largest colonial empire with Europe in complete devastation. Lucky blokes? Or military genius? Neither. Just buggers. The role of the British East India Company was one of a Venetian hand, promoting others to kill themselves. Lord Shelburne, in conjunction with British Prime Minister Pitt, orchestrated the 7 Years' War, and by supporting Frederick the Great with enough money to keep everyone at each other's throats long enough to exhaust Europe, reaped the reward of being elsewhere. This achieved the intent of the European oligarchy to shift their operation of financial usury from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. This shift had been the policy of Sarpi since his role in bailing out a bankrupt and ruined Venetian banking system in the late 1500s, after they had taken their toll, getting hit by the effects of the cultural transformations created by such Renaissance movements as Louis XI's France, transformations which later erupted against Venice in the League of Cambrai. The 7 Years' War established Britain as the new Venetian-style world empire of finance. Britain did not win the war with the British Navy, but a private company, the British East India Company. After 1763, a new policy of anti-imperialism was promoted through the Isles by the likes of Adam Smith, Shelburne, and others, that it was far too costly to maintain the world colonial empire through military occupation. The case had to be made, however, how those colonies, being given full control of their land, would still yield their trade routes and produce for the consumption of the empire. The man plucked for this task was Adam Smith, who, departing to France in 1764, the year after the war, assembled physiocratic doctrine, which, in conjunction with his own, formed what would later be his Wealth of Nations, an apology for this newly formed British Empire, published in 1776 in time for a new method to control the rebel colonies. Shelburne's view was that with this new ideology of free trade, with Britain controlling the sea lanes, the colonies would be looted just as before. However, this takeover by the British Empire soon brought to a head the confrontation with the cultural strivings of America. In Smith's Wealth of Nations, we find the well-known free trade doctrines that when it comes to industry, let it alone. That it is improper to manufacture a good if someone can make it cheaper than you. And that if you promote your own selfish interest, there is an invisible hand that makes sure it leads to a good end, even if you didn't intend it. Refuted by patriots such as Alexander Hamilton in his 1791 Report of Manufactures, and which Matthew Carey in 1819 called a mere sophistry, calculated to embarrass and confound common understandings, a doctrine that would lead to the certain ruin of any nation who adopted it, and Smith as the Delphic oracle of political economy. With such clear, scientific, and ample refutations to choose from, by a history of our founders of our Constitution and American patriots since our inception, why are these mindless, foolish sophistries worshipped still today, globally, by all nations? The secret to this lies not in the long-winded sophistry of Wealth of Nations, but in his earlier treatise, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, better named How to Win Slaves and Influence Them. Someone asks, do you have a fellow feeling with their passion or sentiment? Do you find that the cause or object of someone's passion has an appropriate relation to the way they express it? If so, you sympathize and call their sentiment right, and if not, wrong. Smith continues that the greatest thing we seek is the sympathy of others, and therefore we will adjust our expression of them as necessary to obtain it.
And so then the guy says, what am I, your mother?
We should laugh when others do, and not too loud if our friends only smile.
So I said, now that's what you call a down payment.
If our grief, indignation, admiration is too much for our friend, we won't get his approval. So we lower our passion to that pitch in which the spectators are capable of going along with us. And there is a little man within the breast who forms the correct response to get sympathy from others in reward. But where do we get the information from which to determine what the proper correlations are between someone's passion and the object of that passion, which would allow us to sympathize with them? And where does this little demigod within the breast get informed in order to tell us the appropriate expression of our own passions? There is a place from which we gauge the appropriateness of all sentiments, both others and our own. This is the impartial spectator, that is, popular opinion. If the little man living within our breast is on good terms with this impartial spectator, we will get ahead. All actions of man are thus determined by the imaginary, assumed existence of some point of cultural equilibrium, popular opinion, the impartial spectator, or for Adam Smith, a fine replacement for morality. In his judgment of others and of his self, mankind is therefore essentially a passive object, determined not by himself from within, but formed completely from without. There are no truths or discovered principles which aid man to reason out in his mind what may be right or wrong. It is merely the sensations that impress upon his organs over time and teach him. The self-evident value of sentiments informs him. The use of his reason is limited only to determine what the imaginary, non-existent place of popular opinion thinks, in order to inform him how to act, in order to obtain his selfish desire for approval.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. Tell Mother how good the food is. Maybe Sis rates a compliment too. It makes them want to continue pleasing you.
Smith's society is one of liars and fakers, adopting the sentiments and opinions of those around him, and the cultural norms of his time. And the sum of each person carrying out this holds the whole mess together. Society is thus reducible to the interactions of these sentiments, abstracted out of the context of the human ideas in which they were generated. Where have we heard this before? René Descartes wrote in 1644 that the essence of matter and physical universe around us is the fact that it took up space, that is, had length, width, and breadth, or what he called extension. According to him, all the other physical properties of matter, such as hardness, weight, or color, were not essential to bodies, since they were all conditional and could be taken away under relative velocities in light. For instance, this cup seems hard, but what if it was moving away at the same rate you were moving toward it? Would it still feel hard? And what if you were falling at the same rate as the cup? Would it still feel heavy in your hand? And what if the lights were turned off? You get the picture. Only extension remains, or the fact that the body occupies space, what Descartes thought was a big empty box in which the matter of the universe existed. An extension is thus shown to be the essential character of body from which all other properties of bodies should be able to be derived. From this, Descartes concluded,
"The chief principles of human knowledge seem to me to be contained in the knowledge of a certain corporeal nature, or one extended, divisible, mobile, etc., and also the knowledge of certain sensations which affect us, for example, pain, colors, flavors, etc. I think that no other principles of physics should be accepted or even desired."
In short, there are no principles of physics, merely descriptions of sense. Mankind is thus nothing more than a sophisticated animal. This doctrine of Descartes was a mere revival of ancient sophistries, and in 1691, Leibniz wrote in a French journal,
"If the essence of a body consists in extension, this extension alone should suffice to account for all the properties of the body. But this is not the case. If there were nothing more in bodies than extension or position, that is to say, what geometers know about it, combined with the sole notion of change, this extension would be entirely indifferent with respect to this change, and the result of the impact of the bodies would be explained solely by the geometric position of the motions."
In other words, this inert nature, indifferent with respect to change, would give a moving body the property that when encountering a body at rest, it would transfer its velocity and direction to the body at rest and would receive no diminution of its velocity from the body at rest, regardless of the size of the body it encounters. Obviously, as Leibniz wrote, this consequence of extension is entirely irreconcilable with experiments. He exposed the underlying assumptions further by attacking the cornerstone of Descartes' reputation as a scientist, his famous maxim that in the collisions of bodies, the mass times velocity, or what he called quantity of motion, is always conserved. A concept of force is something you could measure as some quantity of stuff, coherent with extension. Descartes said that if a bigger body with mass 2, velocity 2, with a quantity of motion thus of 4, collides with a smaller body, mass 1, velocity 2, quantity of motion 2, that as the bodies leave from the collision together as one mass, in order to maintain the total quantity of motion as before, which was 4 plus 2, or 6, the velocity of the two bodies moving together with mass 3 would have to be 2. Generalizing all laws of motion from this assumption of the conservation of the quantity of motion, Descartes said, therefore, if a larger body collides with a smaller body, both having the same velocity, the larger will take both bodies in the direction of the larger body, with the same velocity before the collision. However, Leibniz laughed. Descartes also said that if two bodies of equal mass and velocity collide, they will rebound in opposite directions with the same velocity before the collision. This means, when taking these two rules of motion together, derived from the assumption the quantity of motion is maintained, if we reduce the mass of the bigger body continuously until it is the same, we see by the other rule that the body must change direction instantaneously, with all the intervening degrees of change omitted in a single leap, that somehow an infinitely small variation of mass leads to the greatest effect. For where does the change in motion take place? Must there not be a transition in direction of motion? Must there not be a slowing down for an object to change directions? But this particular absurd and impossible consequence of Descartes' intentional incompetence was nothing original. This error Plato showed 2,000 years earlier to be the consequence of the fraudulent method of analysis of Parmenides in his investigation of the one as an object, a method akin to extension, which led the one to change from motion to rest without transition, in what Plato wrote in his Parmenides dialogue,
"It does not change without making a transition. When does it make the transition then? Not while it is at rest, or while it is in motion, or while it is occupying time. Consequently, the time at which it will be when it makes the transition must be that queer thing, the instant."
The consequence of instantaneous change in direction and motion to rest was the same which Leibniz showed for Descartes' assumption of infinitely hard particles, or atoms, which must, being inflexible, have no transition when slowing down from one direction to the other. Such was the false assumption of the nature of physical universe lying at the basis of Descartes' extension. In these and other demonstrations, Leibniz showed that the essence of bodies is clearly not an extension, but in something outside the domain of sense perception. That extension, as Plato likewise implied in his Parmenides dialogue, is merely an effect that is being continually produced by the continuous action of some invisible principle or potential, the possibility of change, which is exhibited in such characteristics as inertia or force, what Leibniz called vis viva. Bodies are not floating in empty space as indifferent matter interacting as hard balls, but have an impetus within them for change, which must be evoked, an invisible, measurable potential, a principle which determines the relations of bodies. In this way, Leibniz showed that in all phenomena, whether it be magnetic, electric, or gravitational, the effects of matter related to these domains exhibit properties such as inertia, or continuous change, which are made possible by evoking the potential of these principles existing as if inside the matter, present even in the smallest change. This science Leibniz called dynamics. So where does this leave Descartes? In fact, Descartes' system was so incompetent that it could have only been designed intentionally so. And this was the case, as he even admitted in his own work that his rules of motion for bodies could never be observed to work out in experiment. Descartes was merely lying, as he well knew that Kepler had already refuted his geometrical method of extension when Kepler refuted Ptolemy's equant as an explanation of motion of planets. This Kepler did by showing that the cause of motion, the sun, had to be considered to have any valid astronomy. Instead of this equant, Descartes merely contrived the assumption of an empty space, an assumption of no change, crucial for leaving out the physical properties inherent in bodies. His whole intention was to leave out anything in science that would require the human mind to make hypotheses of causes, as this would be inconvenient for his political intentions to create a science suitable for the slaves of an oligarchical culture. Merely a coherent cultural doctrine and a defense of this universe void of principle, Smith's theory of moral sentiments is one entirely describable by effects, acting upon effects. Man is essentially passive, and cannot change from within. And like the equant of Ptolemy or the empty space of Descartes, Smith's system is based on a point of no change, the impartial spectator. On the contrary, the true nature of man is as Leibniz showed, that within him is a principle of change, akin to the action of bodies, tapping into the potential of the principle bounding their relations, and thus generating force from within. But for man, on a higher level, tapping into the potential of his own mind, the possibility of changing one's conceptions through the direction of the mind's understanding and experimentation with his world. This capacity, is the essential nature of man, the proper view of human freedom, and pursuit of happiness, which Leibniz wrote in critiquing John Locke. In America, founded on this conception, unlike Smith's oligarchical society, government was founded to be an institution of mind, promoting the creativity of its citizens and directing the economy toward that end. But who could tell today? For how can the government promote that potential of man if the government decides to do nothing, let it alone? By adopting a Cartesian conception of man, we have become a society full of liars, adapting and adjusting to popular opinion just to get by, conforming to somebody's fakery, fitting into niches where that fakery is the standard of opinion. And by adapting to this conception of man, we have submitted to the British Empire's 1763 freedom of trade that was designed to destroy us. Without the direction of mind, mankind loses his advantage as a species and can hardly compete with nature. And whenever mankind replaces his mind with the non-thinking religion of the inherently irrational marketplace, what is the consequence? Therefore, when you think about the holy places of worship today, you have to ask yourself what or who is being worshipped? In who are citizens putting their trust? In who are you putting your faith?